Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for another Healthicity webinar. Today's title of our webinar is The Intersection of Compliance and Security. October, if you're watching this later, this is being aired for the first time in October 2022. October is recognized as Cybersecurity Awareness Month, so we thought this topic would be very timely for all of us. I'm Kyle Brogdon. I'll be the facilitator today. Today's webinar will be 45 to 50 minutes, depending on how much content we have and how many questions we have. Everyone on the call is muted, so we encourage you to use the question dialog box to post questions and to post comments. We will either get to them during the presentation or at the end. And then at the end of the presentation, we will email everyone with links to the webinar recording and the slides. Today's webinar presenters are CJ Wolf and Brian Burton. So CJ Wolf is a healthcare professional with more than 20 years experience in revenue cycle management, practice management, compliance, coding, billing, and client services, and he is a nationally recognized compliance thought leader. Brian Burton has worked in the healthcare industry for more than 15 years, spending most of that time developing, implementing, and providing oversight for compliance and privacy program initiatives. He's worked with more than 100 healthcare facilities. He is certified in healthcare compliance with HCCA and is a project management professional through the Project Management Institute. And with that, I will hand it off to those guys and let them lead the way.
Thank you, Kyle. It's great to be with everybody and be with my colleague, Brian. We're excited to, present today. Here's our agenda. We're gonna just briefly give you a little bit of the background on the Cybersecurity Awareness Month and what resources might be available. But we're gonna spend the bulk of our time talking about tabletop exercises, defining a breach, and then privileged access management. And then we'll open up for your questions. Let's jump in with the Cybersecurity Awareness Month. As Kyle mentioned, October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And you can see on the next slide that we've got our first polling question. Does your organization provide specific education or activities for Cybersecurity Month, Awareness Month? Yes, no, or not sure. So we're gonna launch that poll to see how many of you are already aware of awareness. I have to tell you, I didn't realize, I'm going to share, after the poll, I'm going to share a slide that it's been going on for a long time, almost 20 years. And I have to admit, I did not know it's been that long.
Yep. CJ,
Brian, you probably knew.
It's so great to be here with you today. And yes, I'm interested to see our audience's response to this question. I know in years past, we've been great at recognizing Cybersecurity Month within our organization, and sometimes we get so busy that we don't get to necessarily put out specific education. But it's gonna be interesting to see the audience's responses here.
Yeah, sometimes we don't think about it until something goes wrong, right? Like it's just like our IT support. We never think about them unless our computer doesn't turn on or we're having issues. But there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, and it's important to recognize that that this work is vital to protect organizations and their data.
All right, we are at about 75% of the audience voting, so we will go ahead and close and share those results.
Hey, look at that. Pretty even. So 44% are
wow.
Does have some sort of specific education for Cybersecurity Month. 40% no, and 12% not sure. So pretty evenly split.
Yeah, that's compelling in itself. Audience split, 44-44.
Yeah, excellent. Well, so this is the slide I was talking about. Is that since 2004, the president and the U.S. Congress have declared October to be the Cybersecurity Awareness Month, helping individuals protect themselves online. Now, two organizations are involved in these efforts. The first is CISA. You've probably heard of them, CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. That's CISA. And then the other agency or the other organization is called NCA, which is the National Cybersecurity Alliance. And those two organizations lead this collaborative effort to bring awareness to cybersecurity in the month of October. A few tips on our next slide. what are some things you could just do, some simple things, even if you're not an IT guru like some of our colleagues. I definitely am not, but these are very practical. These are 4 simple cybersecurity practices. First, think before you click, right? I think a lot of us are learning that. You want to recognize and report phishing. Now, I love to fish for real fish. That's not the phishing we're talking about. If a link looks a little off, think before you click. It could be an attempt to get sensitive information or install malware. And Brian, we've seen a lot of issues and settlements and things from OCR where this is how bad actors got into their system, right? It was a human being clicking on something that they probably shouldn't have.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a few extra tips there. Look at the sender. Most of our organizations today have a notice at the top of your inbox that says be cautious. This is from an external sender. Looking at the email address, you can hover over the email address and see the full directory. And that's another good tip to look at. And then the other thing about CISA and the NCA, those Cybersecurity Awareness Month was originally targeted at the consumer, the American population, right? But I think organizations have adopted it as well to really educate their workforce.
Yeah, excellent point. The second item on this slide is update your software. Don't delay. So if you see a software update notification, act promptly, and even better, if you can just turn on automatic updates, that will help you significantly. The next slide are 3 and 4. These are the third and fourth little tips. Use strong passwords. A lot of us know about this. Don't put them on a sticky note on your computer. Use strong passwords. Strong passwords are long, they're unique, randomly generated. You can use password managers to generate and remember different complex passwords. So a password manager will encrypt passwords, securing them for you. And then number 4 is enable multi-factor authentication. You need more than a password to protect your online accounts. So if you enable this, it makes it significantly less likely to get hacked. These are the things where I'm trying to sign in and then it'll send me a code on my phone, right? Or text me a code to put in. That's multi-factor authentication. You're authenticating you as the user in more than one way. And that helps a great deal. Brian.
Well, I was just going to say, it's so funny that today, most organizations that we work for, they require multi-factor authentication. And I think the coaching point here for audience and our family members and our friends, right? So quick story, even my children use MFA for their game consoles, right? A few years ago, one of my children had their account compromised because they were really good at a particular game. But even, Microsoft and PlayStation now enable multi-factor authentication on game consoles. And it's just a good general practice as a reminder, as we talk to our friends and family, helping them understand the importance of cybersecurity.
Yeah, excellent point. So
especially with your banking account information.
Yeah, exactly right. So the other organization I mentioned was the NCA, the National Cybersecurity Alliance. Now, for this month, they have a program called the Champion Program, where you can go to this link and you can enroll as a champion. Why would you do that? They offer a free toolkit for starting your own kind of awareness campaign. Lots of really interesting information that they give you that you don't have to recreate the wheel. There's a PDF guide on this awareness month, ways to get involved, sample social media posts and graphics to kind of help you get the word out. Graphic you can include in your email signature, video call backgrounds you can use. And then on the next slide, the list continues. They also have a sample press release to announce. Brian mentioned, this was initially geared towards the consumer, but you want to, as a company, you probably want to show that you are also involved. And so you can have this sample press release, sample email for employees and customers, logos, branding, different articles and topics that you can use when you're communicating, and tip sheets and infographics, all sorts of things that you can get from this champion program if you enroll. So that's another great thing to do in the month of October. So with that's just a little bit of background on this awareness month, and we're going to jump into some of the meat of our discussion with tabletop exercises. Brian.
Yeah, thank you, CJ. I think it's really compelling thinking about tabletop exercises, and I know Kyle's about to launch our first poll here. Who inside your organization leads those incident response or tabletop exercises? I think we're going to find a balance of responses here. Um, and I know our target audience is mostly compliance and privacy professionals, probably have some IT people and maybe some auditors that might be on today. But really, who in your organization leads? Or if you don't know, maybe select number 5 if you're not aware of your organization's tabletop, and we can explore those a little deeper as we go through the presentation. CJ,
Great, we have launched the poll. Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
no, go ahead. Thank you, Kyle. CJ, I'm curious. I think you and I talked about this before. You've had an opportunity to participate in tabletops. What was one of your biggest takeaways?
For me, it was, and I'll give you a little background. So it was when I was working in the Houston area for a major academic medical center. We were prone to hurricanes. There was a hurricane season. And so we were doing tabletop exercises, not just for IT security, but for other things. But those tabletop exercises included this. And the biggest takeaway for me was just kind of the developing muscle memory, so to speak, on, oh, who do I call? Where do we update? What time of day are we updating? Where's the command center? Who's in charge? Just this communication that a lot of us take for granted. And if you're having some sort of issue, kind of going through that exercise lets you know, oh yeah, I did this exercise once before. I remember who I called. I remember who I reported to. So because it's not something we do every day. And so just kind of going through that exercise was really, really beneficial for me to know about communication.
Yeah, I think I know where Kyle will give us an update on a minute in progress, but in a key point there, communication, because what if a hurricane or a cybersecurity event alters your normal communication path? What is the alternate or the tertiary communication path that you use to rally your response team? And how do you manage that scenario in an event where your normal lines of communication may not be available?
That's right.
All right, we will go ahead and get ready to launch the results of this poll. But in the meantime, Beth asked a question that I would imagine you're both about to answer. Explain the term tabletop exercises. So we'll launch the poll and then let you guys respond with that.
Absolutely. Look at this. Our IT security team leading the way at 43%, compliance and privacy at 16, and our traditional IT team coming in at 12, and then a good percentage of our audience at 27%, not sure. And so I think to Karen's question, we're going to go into that a little bit of detail, and maybe you can carry some of this information back to your compliance team and maybe your IT or IT security team. CJ?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So what is a tabletop?
Yeah, so great question, and Karen, I think had a great question. Tabletop exercises are really akin to playing a game. Many of us, you may recall playing those role-playing games in the past where everybody gets into a room and you have those 100-sided dice, and you're really talking about playing this game. You're setting up this fictional scenario where you're walking through with your character and what are your roles, responsibilities, and responses to certain events, right? A tabletop exercise in a business environment is not really much different. There are multiple scenarios. It might be a cyber threat, could be CJ's example of a potential hurricane or other acts of God. And so these tabletop exercises allow your team an opportunity to practice. And CJ, you mentioned muscle memory earlier. It's going through that exercise just like professional athletes or Olympic athletes, right? It's building that muscle memory that then in turn creates confidence. And under these extreme circumstances, I can't think of something more terrifying than a true cybersecurity event where your organization's faced with some type of malicious malware that's exfiltrating data from your systems, or a ransomware event where some bad actor has commanded some payment of terms in order to decrypt your data. Those are really scary moments for healthcare and for any industry really. But working with your team and all of the responsible parties within your organization, how would you respond? So a tabletop, to answer Karen's question, I'm sure many others, is a practice session. It's a bit of a game that someone in your organization will help lead you through. And on the next slide, you'll see, these typically start with an exercise leader, where this individual and a designee will propose a scenario and then ultimately guide you through that process. They're going to, it traditionally starts with a welcome letter that's going to set the scenario facts for you, right? What are the baseline? Is it a ransomware event? Is it a act of God of some sort, a hurricane, tornado, earthquake? And then ultimately that exercise leader is going to deliver the facts and then monitor the team's responses to those in a almost a fictitious manner or in a theory, but then walk you through that scenario, helping your team. And you'll be surprised at how many lessons you'll learn immediately, right? And when you start practicing these exercises, you'll start to go, oh wow, we need this person on the team. We need this department to respond this way, right? And so it really becomes a really good practiced exercise. And at the end of and these take, they can take 4 hours or a full day. And sometimes if they're really complex, the tabletop exercise might span a couple of days, right? Where you're managing the time invested from the various teams. But really at the conclusion, your exercise leader is going to deliver an evaluation of the overall organization's response, the individual team responses, and then ultimately provide feedback for the participants on how to improve their responses, and then also collect responses from the participants so the exercise leader can make the next tabletop even better.
Yeah, and it's a safe environment for people to make mistakes, right? So it's like you got a message that your medical record is being held ransom. What do you do? Oh, we pay it. Well, that may be the right answer, or it may not, or it's you contact the FBI, or so you're kind of giving different solutions. In what order? Oh, you should have contacted them first, not last. And so it's a safe environment to make those mistakes, right?
And then, oh yeah, what about our cybersecurity insurance carrier? When do we notify them? When do we engage outside counsel? When do we let the privacy officer know, right? So most of those types of events from a ransomware or malware, those are going to originate, be detected by IT personnel or members of your workforce, and it's going to go to IT first. So when and how do we connect with the various people?
Yeah.
And Kyle, on the next slide, we'll talk about different examples, and we've touched on some of these already, but what do we do as an organization when there's a breach? What about malware, ransomware? Another common theme, is some bad actors or organized crime groups that CEO, CFO fraud, right? You get that email that poses as your CFO that says, I'm at a conference, I can't respond via phone right now, but I need you to transfer $100,000 immediately to this account, right? You'd be surprised at how many people respond to those, and that's a crime. And so how does your organization respond to those? And then of course we talked about the physical security, threats of violence, acts of God. How does your organization respond in an active shooter scenario? What happens with the physical security inside your organization? There's the potential threat to the physical security. There's also the potential threat to PHI in that scenario or other sensitive data. So how does your organization respond? And then CJ, we talked about other organization specific types. What about labor unions and protests and other things that might present? How does your organization respond to those events?
Yeah, one of the events that we were talking about was in some research institutions, academic institutions, they may be using animals. What if there are protesters protesting the treatment of those animals and they're preventing individuals from getting into the building? Well, those individuals are the ones that need to be using this data and security. So how are you going to deal with that? Because business needs to go on, patient care needs to go on, research needs to go on, et cetera. So it's kind of working through all those scenarios.
Yep, exactly. And Kyle, on the next slide, for me, I think, and you guys may have seen some of our presentations in the past, and we really talk about the symbiotic relationship between our compliance teams and our IT security teams. In most of these types of events where we'll practice tabletop, that collaboration is really paramount. And you might recall from previous presentations we've done, compliance does not necessarily equal security, and it's true vice versa, right? Security does not necessarily equal compliance. And creating that collaborative approach, regardless if it's a breach, responding to an event, a HIPAA, you're conducting a HIPAA risk assessment, or you're building your education and policy management, right? Collaboration between compliance, privacy, and IT security is absolutely important to every organization. And we'll talk about that again some more on the next slide. And so really what we're hoping the audience takes away today is both of those teams within your organization should be working to keep each other informed, because the ultimate goal is to remain compliant and secure for your organization. So you might be asking yourself, where can I learn more about Tabletop? This was really fast. There's a lot of information in just 4 or 5 slides. Where can I learn more? The Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CJ highlighted it earlier, CISA, they have a really great package. And when you guys get the slide deck, this graphic actually takes you to a hyperlink to their website. But they offer these really great tabletop exercise packages from various types of activities that you can download and use and bring to your next compliance committee or to your next internal team meeting, or walk into your CISO's office and ask, has our organization conducted a tabletop? Can I participate as a compliance person? Can we do this together? And so with that, one more poll question, if the audience could, in the short presentation we have today, where would you rank the value in that collaboration between compliance and IT, or your compliance department participating in those incident response tabletops? And as Kyle launches the poll, CJ, in your past experience, how did this work for your previous roles?
Yeah, so compliance, it was important because, in some scenarios, compliance is probably a little bit lower down in the priority list, but it needs to be thought of, right? If you're having some sort of weather event or active shooter, like safety, right? Safety is the primary event, priority, and you're worried about those things first. But as those things get under control, you want to make sure that the other things are not left off the table, like compliance, right? Breaches, making sure that you're documenting things appropriately. So, the value in compliance to me is sometimes after that immediate urgency, but it's not too far after that, right? And they need to be aware of it while the event's happening so they can be revved up and prepared to jump in, because you just don't know what kind of compliance ramifications there could be of certain events. Now, I think the importance of compliance is a lot higher when it's maybe like ransomware or malware or something where data and PHI has been potentially breached in some way. Now compliance needs to be at the table from the get-go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think great point, because physical safety of human life is always going to be the most important aspect of any of these scenarios. But to your point, when ransomware or malware becomes the potential threat, where does our compliance and privacy team sit, and what is that importance?
Can I hit you guys with one question that's in the queue while we wait for the final votes here? We've got about 65%. Come on, folks, jump in and vote. We've got a question from Kathy. She wants to know, how does multi-factor align with single sign-on?
Well, that's a great question. So single sign-on, there are various tools. I won't advocate for one or the other, just in general practice. But single sign-on, it can be a tool within your organization that allows an individual authenticated user to connect to multiple systems using one authentication. So there's a pass-through, a bi-directional authentication between systems. So an example might be you authenticate to your device through Microsoft Azure or Google, and then every application your organization uses downstream from your initial login, your credentials are being passed to that system for authentication purposes, and that would be single sign-on. Multi-factor authentication is when you use an alternate solution like text messaging. There's a Google authenticator that's available for free. Microsoft has an authenticator that's for free, and there's a number of other solutions out there. But it's really a second authentication. So you enter your password, and then you get another alert from a different device that you are confirming you are that person and you have authenticated.
Yeah. One way I kind of look at it, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, is think of your front door to your house. It might have one doorknob with one lock, but it also might have a bolt at the top.
Yeah.
And the bolt at the top may be the same key, it may be a different key. And so you could get somebody who somehow gets into that first lock, but the second lock could stop them. And so it's kind of, before somebody's allowed entry, they have to pass both of those. That's the multi aspect of it, right?
It's a pretty good metaphor, yes.
All right, let's look at those results.
Look at that, imperative. I like it. 0 insignificant and only 4% minimal. That's good. It means we're talking to the right audience and we have the same belief system. That's pretty good. And we're open to any other questions. CJ, you have any thoughts?
No, I think that's spot on. Compliance needs to be at the table and as early as possible. So great response. Thanks everybody for participating. We will have some others, so keep close to that clicker so you can join in on these other polls. So now we're going to talk about how do you define a breach, and this may be a little bit more in a compliance officer's wheelhouse, right? Like Tabletop, I'm a little uncomfortable, I've never done it, but here you're probably a little bit more familiar with this. So on the next slide, we just asked the question, what is a breach? Now we're talking in the context of HIPAA, right? So a breach means the acquisition, access, use, or disclosure of PHI, protected health information, in a manner not permitted under the rules, not permitted under the security and privacy rules. And it compromises either the security or privacy of that PHI. So that's a pretty broad definition, and you're still probably saying, well, I still don't know what the answer is. Okay, but that's what we have to go by. So, but let's break it down a little bit. Okay, so on the next slide, we're going to first ask you, who in your organization determines if a breach has occurred, and a breach as defined by HIPAA? So is it anybody? Is it your IT folks that are the ones who determine? Is it compliance that is the final say? Is it legal? Combination of the above? So let's say you have an allegation of a breach. Who's going to determine whether that allegation is true or not? And this, I think, is going to be interesting, Brian, because I've worked in many organizations in compliance roles, and I've seen this vary. I'm curious if you've seen it vary as well. I don't want to sway anybody while they're answering, but what are your thoughts? Have you seen it vary, or have you seen pretty consistent leadership when it comes to breach determination?
Did we lose Brian? We
Oh,
may have lost Brian.
maybe we lost him.
CJ, I've got a couple of questions if you want to tackle them while we're waiting for Brian to come back.
That'd be great.
We have Christine says it's valuable to have compliance at the table, but how many organizations actually include compliance in these tabletop exercises?
Yeah, that is such a good question. I have been in organizations where compliance has not been involved, but it really comes down to a bigger cultural issue, right? If you're not at the table on these types of things, are you at the table on strategic things, right? How many of us, because I've been in the position where I've started a compliance program and I'm the afterthought. So somebody's, starting a new clinic or a new service line, and then they've already been working on it for months, and then they come to compliance and say, we need your approval. Well, if there's something wrong, you've just wasted all those months. And so I've been in situations like that. And what I try to do is I try to wiggle my way in. Most of the time, I don't think people are purposefully excluding compliance. That may be the case in some scenarios, but most of the time, I just think oh, they think of it after the fact, like they're like internal audit, where my belief is that compliance plays a role proactively in decision making and strategy and vision for the organization. So some of the key elements of a compliance program is making sure your compliance officer is a senior level person who is allowed to attend these types of meetings and have a say.
Very good. All right, we will go ahead and share these results and see if we can get Brian back.
So who determines? There we go. So compliance officer or privacy officer is 55%. They're the ones who decide. That's the number one answer. Then 37% is the second most common, which is a combination of the above. Legal, 3%, information technology, 3%, and anyone, 1%. So I've typically seen the last one, combination of the above. Now, compliance or the privacy officer might lead the work to determine if there's a breach, but I haven't seen in too many organizations. Plus, the caveat is I've been in very large organizations. In large organizations, it's typically not a one-person determination, right? You want to have backup. You want to have a process in place in case that person leaves. What knowledge walks out the door when they leave. You want a process in place that survives individuals. And so I typically have seen some sort of combination or maybe a committee. But there's many right ways to do it, right? There's not just one right way. So thanks everybody for sharing, and appreciate that.
Yep, that's fantastic, CJ.
Yeah. Any other thoughts from you, Brian, before we go to our next slide?
No, I'm with you. I think depending on the circumstances and the fact, for me in my experience, it's been either a combination of the above or the compliance and privacy, and it really depends on the nature and the extent of the breach and whether or not, based on the relevant facts of the potential disclosure, who all is involved. And usually the compliance team's leading that charge, but it can come from other sources.
Yeah, exactly. Now, not every alleged breach is an actual breach, right? There's what's known as a data breach risk assessment that you can undergo. And if it has to have a minimum of these factors, it might have more. But let's say I lose a laptop and there's information, there's PHI on it. Let's say it's stolen. Does that automatically mean it's a breach? Well, it's presumed to be an impermissible disclosure until you have kind of gone through this risk assessment, and then you might call it a breach. If that laptop is secured through encryption at a very high level, that may be okay to say, look, even though we lost the device, there's no way somebody's going to get in there. The PHI is not going to be compromised, and so it's not a breach. But these are the factors to consider. First, it's the nature and extent of the PHI involved. So a person's name and address and birth date may be a little different than, let's say, there was a breach of medical device numbers, right? So each medical device might have its own kind of number assigned to that device, maybe a 12-digit number. How are you going to identify a person from that unless you have additional information? So that's what this first one is kind of talking about. It includes the type of identifiers and the likelihood that somebody could be re-identified. What if all you have are zip codes? How likely is it that somebody's going to be re-identified just from that zip code? So that's some factors to consider. The second one is unauthorized person who used the PHI or to whom the disclosure was made. Okay. The third is whether the PHI was actually acquired or viewed. That kind of goes to my scenario of a lost laptop. The laptop may be out of our possession, but if it's encrypted to a high enough level, it may never have been acquired or viewed, right? And then the last one is the extent to which the risk to the PHI has been mitigated. And I think my scenario with the encrypted laptop also goes to that, is you've mitigated through proper encryption. Brian, any thoughts on any of these? I know I gave some examples, but I know you've done these breach risk assessments as well. Do you have anything?
I think there's a lot of ways that an organization can choose to apply this. The rule within HIPAA is very clear, the nature and extent and these four factors, right? but you can conduct this breach risk assessment using a wide array of tools. But ultimately, it comes down to some subjective analysis based on the facts that we've collected and helping an organization determine whether or not there's a greater than a low probability of harm that impacted the data or the individuals that may have been included.
Exactly. And that, what you just said is the key phrase, right? What you're determining through this risk assessment is if you have a low probability. If you have a medium or high probability, you're probably going to have to call it a breach. So what you want to do is set this up in a way, and to Brian's point, there is some subjectivity to it, but you do your best, you be consistent, and you document it consistently so that when you're calling something low, then you can determine, look, we don't think this is a breach because there's a low probability. So
I think you hit a highlight for me in being consistent in your organization. And of course, the larger your organization, the more difficult it is to make sure that your analysis of the risk is consistently applied throughout your organization.
Yeah, and in large organizations that I've been in, all potential breaches, and we call them potential until it's gone to this committee to determine, right? All potential breaches must be filtered through the committee, so that ensures the consistency. They have a flow chart and a process to say, look, if somebody in the OB-GYN department says we had a breach, or somebody in research says we have a breach, it has to go through this committee to actually determine it and use consistent factors. And then you want to document it. So on the next slide, once you've determined whether it is a breach or not, that's why that risk assessment is so key, because if you've determined a low probability, then you don't have breach responsibilities, notification responsibilities. If you've determined it is, then you have these responsibilities, which is covered entities and business associates must provide notification to the affected individuals, to the secretary. And what they mean by the secretary here is the secretary of HHS. We're not talking about your secretary. We're talking about the secretary of HHS, Health and Human Services, meaning you have to report to the government the breach. And in certain circumstances, you have to report to the media. If a certain number, the threshold, I believe, Brian, is 500, over 500.
Yep.
Then you also have a duty to report to the local media so that they can get the word out. Now, the second bullet point is that business associates must notify covered entities, okay, if a breach occurs. And the last bullet that I'm going to make a point about is administrative requirements and the burden of proof. What I mean by this is you can't just say, oh, we did a breach risk assessment and determined it was low probability, case closed, next. You need to keep documentation, right? The burden of proof is on you to demonstrate after the fact that you did a thorough risk assessment and you followed consistent criteria and you determined that it was low probability. Or if you determine that it's not low probability, you've determined it's a breach, the burden of proof is on you to show that you contacted the affected individuals. You need to keep documentation that you contacted the secretary. You need to, if it's over 500, you need to keep documentation that you contacted the media, because the burden to demonstrate you followed these rules is on you. And this is an important part of compliance programs. It's keeping that documentation. And a lot of organizations use some sort of system. I'll put a plug in here for Healthicity and Compliance Manager. That's an example of a system where you could keep those records, keep those analysis, keep those determinations, and you have them as a part of your compliance program. The next slide is where can you learn more? So we've given you high level kind of information, but here are some examples. If you want to know about encryption standards, for example, that first link might be a good place to go, because it's guidance to demonstrate that you've rendered unsecured PHI indecipherable. Breach notification is the second bullet. There's rules and guidelines for what you have to do, and that's the nuts and bolts if you need that. And then what if I do have to submit a notice that I had a breach to the Secretary of HHS? How do I do it? Is it in the mail? Is it on the computer? Well, go to this link and it'll show you some steps and give you some guidance on how you would notify if you have to. And I think that ends our section 3, and we're on to section 4, which is our last major section before questions, privilege access management. I'll let Brian kind of tee that off for us.
Thank you, CJ. So I'm presuming some portion of our audience may be unfamiliar with this term. It may be especially as it relates to tools or information security, but as a number of organizations have defined privileged access management as an information security mechanism which safeguards individuals' credentials with elevated access or capabilities beyond regular users. So many of us historically have worked in HIPAA and privacy in the past. We'll refer to those individuals with elevated privileges, and we've always had solutions to monitor those. But what we'll see on the next slide is there are some emerging tools, or excuse me, out of order. So privilege access management governance. I'll get to the tools on the next slide. My apologies. Thank you. We'll stay here, Kyle. Thanks. So what is privilege access management, and how do I implement this in my organization? So there's some really good resources that are available to us. One that I've created a link here on this slide to ISACA. Creating that governance is the strategy your organization takes to monitor the endpoints, the targets, policies, controls, and responsibilities, and the overall life cycle of your privileged access management. And if you were to use this link, you can browse out to ISACA. They have this really great structured approach to establishing that governance. And one portion of that governance is the actual tools. Thank you, Kyle. On the next slide. And so there are some emerging tools out there where, a privileged access management tool will be so specific as to monitor the video and sound from an individual who has elevated privileges and is accessing areas of your information systems which are sensitive. So it might do a screen record of what the individual's doing, and then video record who is the actual individual. So using our cameras to monitor, and microphones, right? To really deeply monitor what that individual with elevated privileges, what did they do in your environment? And so one of the things as these start to evolve, and you'll see probably if you talk to your IT security teams, some of the, some teams are starting to consider and implement these tools. But my question for us as compliance and privacy professionals is, how does a tool like this impact our policies? And as we move into the next slide, for me, I imagine there's two distinct policies that most of us have, where some type of privileged access management tool will need to be considered. From our uses and disclosures policy, ensuring that our privileged access management tools are considering the minimum necessary requirements of HIPAA, maybe your state privacy requirements, and how your organization is defining privileged access and the management thereof. And then, of course, the other traditional IT security policy of access control. Is your policy adequately describing the tool and its governance process before you implement a solution like this inside your organization? And then I think this is our last poll question for today, but does your organization consider elevated privileges or privileged access management and tools inside your HIPAA policies? And CJ, I'm curious, because this is really such a new topic within the industry.
Yep.
Have you had any experiences with a privileged access management tool?
It's such a great, I was learning as you and I were developing the slide deck, you were teaching me about this, and I haven't seen, I'm working with clients and, looking at their policies. I have not seen anybody with this yet in their HIPAA policies. And so that could mean one of two things. It could mean they have privileged access management, it's just not in their policies, or they just don't have privileged access management. So I think this is going to be something that I'm going to be looking for more as I work with clients. Have you seen most organizations going to this? Like in the scenario I just brought up, do you think my assumption 1 or assumption 2 is more accurate? That they have PAM and that's just not in their policies, or they just don't have PAM?
Well, I think most of our organizations consider consider elevated privileges, and how does your organization respond to an individual, an
Right.
authorized individual who has elevated privileges. What I haven't seen a lot of is the implementation of those tools.
I see.
And so I see a lot of marketing campaigns. I see a lot of references from CISA and other federal agencies that are starting to refer to these tools.
Right.
But I haven't seen broad, wide adoption of them yet. And so, but what tickled my brain was to, okay, so this is great. So we're screen capturing this individual with elevated privileges. We're video recording and audio recording them as they conduct their work. How does that impact our uses and disclosures policy? Can we make that fit into minimum necessary? And then also from our user access policy, are we really looking at that governance process and then considering that tool and its impact to our organization? As good as a security practice as it may be, does it create potential conflicts with our policy?
Yeah, excellent point.
And so it looks like our audience response is, leading the way with not sure, might be just that it's a good time for us as compliance and privacy professionals to take that question back to your IT teams, provoke the question, and see where your organization may be leaning towards the consideration of these tools.
Yeah, that's such a good point.
And on our last slide here, where can I learn more? This is great. Share these 3 links with your IT security teams. CISA has a great website on privileged access and even a use case, right, for their implementation of a privileged access management tool. They don't specify what the tool was, but just a system application that did the whole screen capture, recording, both video and audio. And then, of course, ISACA, we referenced this earlier with the governance process. And then there's some free education available through the NICCS, which is a link that you can find through CISA. It is not a government agency, but they have a partnership between CISA and the NICCS where you can get some free education.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Excellent.
So
Q&A time.
Yeah, we're to the point where we can get some more questions. And I also welcome comments if others have ideas, even if you don't have a question, right?
Yeah, and we got Brian back. He's back in the flesh. All right, so this is from a while back. This is earlier in the webinar, so you might have to reach back into your memory. Stuart says, is the EL usually a project manager with an IT background?
Oh, it depends on the circumstance. I think it really depends on the exercise. Project management professionals, you guys, you may or may not know, I have maintained my project management professional certification for quite some time. I think that's the right skill set to organize and manage a tabletop exercise. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a project manager. It could be a designee of your chief compliance and privacy officer, or your chief information security officer, or someone on their team. It could be an outside agency if you're interested. Healthicity offers some of those services to help your organization manage and lead those. There are tons of other great vendors out there that can provide those services. So I think it really depends on what your organization needs and how you want to develop and build your tabletop exercise program.
Awesome. All right, fun question. What about faxes with PHI sent to the wrong person?
Well, depending on who that wrong person is and whether or not they are a covered entity or a business associate, and whether or not, those happen. We're human. At CJ, I'm sure you've managed several reports like that where we receive those potential breaches. Anytime that scenario occurs inside your organization, highly recommend you create some type of investigation documentation, whether that be inside Compliance Manager like Healthicity offers or some other similar tool, and then go through the data breach risk assessment process to determine whether or not a breach has occurred.
Yeah, and keep in mind there are 3 exceptions by definition. The definition of the breach, and some might fall under your scenario, like an unintentional acquisition, access, or use by a workforce member or person acting under the authority of a covered entity or business associate, if that access was made in good faith and within the scope of authority. So, like Brian just said, if the fax was supposed to go to the patient's OB-GYN doctor and it went to their surgeon instead, it's not really going to probably be a breach, right, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, depending on circumstances, right, and whether or not it was further used or disclosed by
Right.
the impermissible recipient. But also, in that scenario, if you send that fax to the local car wash, you know, might have a problem.
Right.
If you send it, if it was intended
Do
to go to
car
the,
washes use faxes, Brian? Do car washes use
sometimes,
faxes?
be surprised. Um, And if it went from, if it went to your internal administration fax instead of the
Right.
intended clinic, you probably have an exception that you can make. But documentation is key.
Yeah.
Alexis, I think that probably answered your question as well. She asked something along the lines of if if patient information was accessed impermissibly, but there was no malicious intent, can it be determined as a HIPAA violation without notification to the patient? Can the case be determined as a HIPAA violation without notification of the patient?
Yeah, there's always keep in mind there are, to CJ's point, we haven't really articulated them for today's presentation, but those three exceptions are for payment, treatment, or operations. If you had an impermissible access from an internal, from one department nurse to another doctor, you may have inadvertently accessed. That's going to fall into the treatment category of being inadvertent access. Probably not. If you have someone who's truly snooping, looking to find out about a coworker or a celebrity, something of that nature, then you got a different set of circumstances. What I do recommend is find a good tool that you like. There are a number of them out there for conducting those data breach risk assessments that will help you walk through not only the exceptions but the 4 factors and then all of the qualifying facts.
All right.
And then maybe keep your eye out on Healthicity because we in the future sometime have something similar.
Absolutely. What happens when privacy policy conflicts with IT policy? There are different departments who don't talk to one another very much, but the policies often cover the same subjects.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's the whole ethos of today's conversation is to create that collaboration. Meet with your CISO, meet with your IT personnel or your CIO, create that collaboration. But use that as the catalyst to start the conversation. Hey, we have this policy, our uses and disclosures policy says this, the IT security access policy says that. Let's talk about how they might overlap and how we can collaborate to make sure we remain consistent for all members of our workforce.
Yeah, and on a general note with that, just general compliance program effectiveness, one of the elements is policies and procedures, and I would put forth that means your organization has some sort of consistent, consolidated way to get rid of duplicate policies, right? And so you want to make sure you don't have silos, that this department gets to set up their policy and it conflicts with this department setting up their policy. When there are conflicts, it should go up to some sort of higher level of decision making.
Okay, I think we got time for one more question. So Kristen says, how do you suggest encouraging employees in the organization to be more forthcoming about breach concerns or even near misses? Our hotline is generally very quiet.
CJ, I'll let you take that one first.
Yeah.
I have a couple ideas, but go ahead.
I've seen this in a lot of organizations. I don't think there's a quick fix. To me, this generally comes down to culture. And do people feel safe in reporting? I think we've all experienced it where we've reported something, we've admitted a mistake. Depending on how our supervisor or somebody reacts will dictate if and how we report future mistakes. And this is really a culture issue. And you really need to, in my opinion, dig deep and find out if the hotline is silent, there may be a reason. And doing employee surveys throughout the whole organization, asking about speak up culture and feeling safe and non-retaliation and those sorts of things. You can have things on paper and say, oh, we have an anti-retaliation policy, but the practice may be different than what's on paper.
And I think for me, one of the things, and I've talked about this before in previous presentations, as compliance and privacy professionals, as your current organization's policies permit through COVID, get out and about in your organization. If you're a member of the compliance or privacy team, go visit the other departments. Be visible in the hospital or in your clinic. Be available to answer questions, giving some confidence and reassurance that you're a real person as the compliance team or the privacy team, and that you're here that's our job, right? As compliance and privacy professionals, it's really to serve our workforce. It's through education, policy management, and being available to address their concerns. So one of the ways you can do that is being present in those spaces, be visible to those workforce members, giving them the confidence they can trust you.
All right, guys, with that, we will wrap things up for this webinar. Thanks to both of you, CJ and Brian, for another awesome presentation and all the good information. We've already gotten a lot of excellent feedback from those in attendance. So we will launch one more poll, but I'll tell you before we launch that, if we didn't get time to get to your question, please post it on our blog at healthicity.com, or you can send an email to either of these guys, cj.wolf@healthicity.com or brian.burton@healthicity.com, and they'll get to that as soon as they can. Make sure you follow us on our relevant social media channels. We post a lot of good information like this. And as we're closing this out in our poll, please let us know what you thought about this webinar. We use these to get better and to give you more relevant information. So we would appreciate your vote there. And stay tuned to our email chains and to our website and our blog for future presentations just like this. And CJ and Brian, I'll let you guys say goodbye and we'll close it out.
Thank you for being the moderator today, Kyle. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And CJ, my friend, as always, I look forward to the next one.
Yes, ditto. And thank you all for attending. Appreciate your participation.
Thank you all. Goodbye.